Unfortunately, Sunset City has found itself in a little bit of hot water recently. To its lackluster and controversial grand opening of the World Exposition, to the ridiculous amount of money spent on the design hotel. We've got crime and corruption creeping into our city, and then down south, gangs are starting to roam the islands. All of which, not exactly helping our financial situation. Sunset City is in its worst financial state. It's not all bad news though. Big business owner Eva Van Klaus is moving her tech company, Sandbox Microsystems, to Sunset City. They've recently just scored a government contract to build microchips and software for the phased space program. Pretty exciting stuff for the small tech company, and the added industry might just help the city, but more on that later. But to be honest, all of this is just an excuse so that I can build a massive distribution center, all of which is powered and fueled by a glorious network of train line. Look, it ain't no secret, I love a good old industrial train line. The way they navigate and weave around these buildings, influencing the industrial spaces, they're so great. And when Dodgy got in touch on Discord and mentioned that we need more spaces like this, more industry fueled by these train lines. Yeah, you're right Dodgy, let's do it. But first, speaking of money, let's waste a little bit more of it. Let's continue to flush a little bit more money down the World Expo toilet. That's been working out pretty well for us so far. In the last episode, I asked you guys how we could jazz up the waterfront a little bit more, and quite a lot of people said an amusement park and a Ferris wheel would be great around here. I totally agree. I first figured maybe near the hotel where we had a little bit of extra space. However, as I cycled through the different types of Ferris wheels that I had, I realized that it was a little bit far away from the grand entrance of the Expo. It needed it to be a little bit closer than that, but did we have the space for it? Well, not really. But then I had the brilliant, but then also a little bit dumb idea that maybe we could use this space over here. This is an area that is already taken up by a bit of a park, but I like to imagine that this was an area that was developed at the same time as the exposition. Now, this is a brilliant idea for a lot of good reasons. I love the fact that it is its own little place. You can visit the amusement park without having to go into the exposition grounds. This is pretty similar to the way that a lot of the other amusement parks were kind of operating within the expositions that we've been taking inspiration from. Pretty close to the entrance, but then you can also just get your own entry fee to these places. You don't just have to go into the expo. I also love how close it is to the downtown. This might even be something we end up keeping down the track once the exposition has finished. It's also really close to public transport with a ferry stop right next door and a monorail line, just begging for a monorail station. So many reasons to love this spot for an amusement park. Why would I not want to build one here? Well, because I shouldn't build one in the first place because I have no money. Well, luckily we can just charge people entry fee. Oh yeah, that's right. Why are people going to come here when there's an overpowered amusement park right next door? So I decided to abandon the amusement park for now and just work on trying to make a little bit of money, raising up some taxes, and also turning off some very expensive unique buildings that we didn't really need at this point. We really just needed to make some money so we can make some money. And yeah, after a little bit of this, we were starting to make some money, but then we quickly started losing again. So we're going to realize is this is going to happen until we do start adding in a little bit more industry. But for now, I want to get back to adding in some more suggestions into our World Expo. We'll get back to our theme park when I've got a little bit of extra time. I think that deserves a proper episode. But a little aquarium on the end of this road here, that's a perfect little addition. I love this idea. This is part of the Park Life DLC, something I've never placed down before. And then on the left hand side, we still had a little bit of swampland still intact, and I figured this would be the perfect spot to have some sort of educational boardwalk where people can explore and see some of the wildlife. And to be fair, probably not the best spot for a nature boardwalk quite like this, but I mean, this is kind of what cities do, right next to an airport, right next to a busy expo. Yeah, classic city behavior. Within the boardwalk path, I am also making sure that I am placing down something that will attract people to this area. So I am placing down some spawners within the actual boardwalk so that people will end up coming here, and it will also increase the attractiveness of this area, improving the expo ever so slightly. So whenever I do add anything to the expo, just know that I am also making sure that it has something to function as well. But there is a little bit of extra space back here, and I think that might be something that we add for the hotel. I think we need some sort of pool or recreational area for that, but I'm not really sure at this stage. We'll get back to it. Speaking of stage, here's a stage. This is something I definitely knew I wanted to include, and it just fitted in perfectly in this little spot. I also wanted to include some sort of sphere because I feel like every World Expo has some sort of sphere, but this just, I don't know, really couldn't figure out where I was going to place it. At one stage I thought it was going to fit within the stage, but it didn't fit in with the stage, so at this stage we're just going to delete it. Stage. But just like the boardwalk, I wanted to make sure that this was going to function and add something extra to the expo, so I am also adding in an event, another event. That is 8 of them now within the exposition. So that's a lot. That's a lot of people being attracted to our expo. So at the moment, this is attracting the most amount of people in Sunset City. All tourists are pretty much coming here, which means that you don't really see a huge amount of other people in any other parts of Sunset City in terms of tourism. They're mostly at the expo, which is totally fine, but man, it's really starting to show because there's a lot of stuff going on down here. But I did just want to add one more thing to the expo before we moved on. For the Valdez Pavilion, someone mentioned a while back that this also might be a great spot to showcase upcoming and new models of motor vehicles. Yeah, great idea. So I figured this might be a great spot for Miyagi Motors. Miyagi is Mr. Miyagi on the Steam Workshop, who also has these great assets that he's also created, and I thought that this could be a great spot to maybe show some super futuristic vehicles just out the front. And they are pretty crazy looking, they are hyper futuristic, but I also kind of like that. You know, Expos and even the 80s were pretty hyper futuristic, making real bold predictions of what the future is going to look like. So I do really like that. But I also thought that maybe Sandbox Microsystems have something to do with this showroom. Maybe they've got something to do with microchips within these vehicles, but I think maybe microchips in cars is a bit of a stretch in the 80s. I don't really know. I don't really know much about cars or microchips for that matter. But the logo is there, so they've got some sort of involvement. I don't really know what it is at this stage, but that is it for the expo. We're gonna move on. Yeah, let's move on to another little spot. Well, really just around the corner, because I wanted to add in some of these little cubes that are hotels, all part of the Hotels and Resorts DLC. Well, this isn't part of the Hotels and Resorts DLC, but I did mention that wouldn't it be great if you could just have little cubes that you could just place inside your pre-existing hotels or resorts around your city? Well, someone made that, and these are way better than I expected because they tell you really easily which hotels they are and their star rating, and they also provide the name. So I'm going through and adding these blocks into 3 of these hotels that sit pretty close to the downtown and right next to the expo, so in a true prime location. I want to give the same treatment to our islands down south, so going down to Santa Julia and placing in a couple of those cubes within our resorts, making sure that they are functioning the way that hotels and resorts are going to function. We actually have so many of these around the city and around the Seminole states that I reckon we could actually make a little bit of income by placing these within some of these buildings. Also making sure that we've got a bit of public transports to make sure that these are going to function the absolute best that they can. Knowing that people are staying within these hotels is just such a good time. The Seminole Keys is just becoming a real lovely place for tourists. I absolutely love it down here. Except for Gator Bar. Gator Bar is still just as dodgy as ever. If not, maybe dodgier. I've decided to name these guys the Sunriders, which was a name suggestion quite a lot of people came up with in the last episode. So it does beg the question, what are these dodgy malakas doing down in La Gloria? Well, this is just a great place to kick back, relax, and get around customs. The islands stretching down the Seminole Keys, these are, pretty close to the international border and also nice and close to the islands that are just outside of the Seminole state. I reckon you could very easily just chuck a couple of goods onto an old fishing liner, a yacht, or maybe even a seaplane and just watch that sail off into the distance. I don't think there'd be too much in terms of rules or regulations around here, or maybe there is, and you could just slide a little bit of money underneath the table and call it a day. That's what's going on down here. This was a suggestion and I really loved it. I also really love the idea that we can, in fact, connect all this up to our little island that's far off into the distance. This is an island that we will work on eventually. It's still a little whiles away, but for now we've got a ferry service that is going out that way. I know it's a little bit odd, a ferry service, but I did just want to see a boat heading in that direction. So it's there, it's a lot of fun. It's also wasting a bit of money as per usual, but you know what? I think it's worth it. So we're 10 minutes in, and I haven't even started building the thing that this whole episode's about. Well, in true Tudor style, I actually started working on this massive distribution center way back before the Expo was even built. Even before I abandoned this industrial site, I began to work on the distribution center, even thinking I could just tack it onto the end of an episode. Oh, how wrong I was. Because, as you're going to find out, this isn't something that you can just tack on to the end of an episode. I can barely fit this into one episode. This build snowballs completely out of control, but for good reason, and we'll get to that later. But for now, look at this mess. The whole reason why I want to work down here is because this is just a zoned nightmare. This is just buildings zoned and forgotten about. And I cannot forget about this, because this is meant to represent something really important, something that I absolutely love about cities. Industrial sites fueled by good rail infrastructure. And not to sound like a broken record, but how great are these industrial sites? I love the fact that you can see the path of rail, you can see how they have to navigate buildings and roads, you can see where lines used to be active but no longer in use. But back in the 80s, these would have still been in use. Maybe not quite as much as in the past, but definitely still active. And you can see these places so clearly in Google Earth, but when you're on Street View and just walking around, you kind of go, oh hey, there's a train line there. That's so interesting. What's it doing there? What's it going into? I love that. So if you're wondering why I've got so much money, well, it's because I started this ages ago and then realized that this was going to be much larger than I had really provided myself to really complete. So this is me just sort of chipping away going, yeah, hey, this is all part of the one episode, all part of that train episode. Just make a big old industrial site. You've made these a million times before. What's so hard about it? Just do it. Well, as it turns out, kind of hard, because I wanted to make sure that this was also functioning and fueling my city, making sure that the rail line was going to be in use. So I've got these train lines coming into these little spaces here, and I'm trying to fit in some buildings so that we've got enough space so that we can also add in some sort of cargo terminal. And for the most part, I did like the style of it, and I'm going to keep the general idea of the way that I've created it, but it is just way too small. You're going to see very quickly that we do run out of space. We don't really fit in the types of buildings and the types of vehicles that are going to be needing to use this space. They don't really fit into it, so we're going to have to make it a little bit bigger than this. But I did kind of like the style of it. I love the fact that you have these really tight areas that trains do need to navigate around, and the buildings do have to kind of take shape to maneuver around the train line too. I also really like that. That is the whole reason why I like these areas. But as you can see, the trucks just needed a little bit more space to maneuver around the road layout. They also needed a way to come into the distribution center to also make their way around and, deliver goods and pick up goods and, just make deliveries a lot smoother. They weren't going to get around that. So I needed to make things just a little smidge bigger. Pretty much doubling in size and also adding in an entrance on either side. I also wanted to include another train line just sort of snaking its way out in this direction. We're going to add something else to that a little later on. But as you can see, there's a lot of playing around with the different types of buildings, figuring out which one was going to work best, which ones sort of fit in with the same sort of style, because I am doing quite a bit of splicing, trying to figure out which ones kind of all match, making it so that it looks like it was all built at the same time, and maybe even added upon over time as well. But I was starting to feel pretty satisfied with where that was turning out. It was now time to start figuring out what the rest of the buildings were going to look like. Something that I knew that was going to be challenging with these buildings was to make it so that it looked like these buildings were kind of cut into the shape of the arch of the train line. You know, that sort of archy look that you kind of get around these industrial spaces. Yeah, how was it going to do that? My first instinct was to use procedural objects and just sort of, skew it into a shape that kind of matched it. And it was alright, it did the job, but it was a little bit triangular for my liking. Not that I got anything wrong with triangles, but I just feel like I wanted something that was a nice circular, archy shape. Something nice and smooth. So I instead tried to splice in a network instead. And that worked pretty well, but then trying to make it fit in with this procedural object was a little bit weird, so that wasn't quite working. So I decided to just completely remove the procedural object building and instead just make a pretend building here. These are made by wall networks and also using some surface on top, placing in a couple of building windows on the side and just adding in some bits and pieces on top, such as some vents and some decals. Really just kind of sold it. I feel like this is the perfect fit for these areas, and we'll just copy and paste this idea into other spots. And just like that, we're back to present time, losing money and just miserably in debt. Yeah, so all of that was done quite a while back, and then I have jumped back into game and have tried to just make this work. Figured that this was now the best time to try and make some money using this industry. And that is, of course, the best way to make money in this game is through industry. However, I am also placing down a lot of infrastructure, expensive infrastructure like train lines and cargo terminals and warehouses and even factories. If they're not hooked up properly, then they're not really money makers, they're money losers. And that's no good. At this point, I'm still playing around with some of the warehouses within this area, but not massively satisfied with how it's turning out. I decided that I probably need to place down a couple more bigger buildings. Why not place down another massive warehouse? This new one that I had no idea about, I guess it was introduced with one of the updates, but it is a warehouse that also has a direct connection to the train line. So this is absolutely perfect for this area, and it even fits in pretty damn nicely. Except for this. This was not good. So that kind of stuffs things up. Well, luckily we got Move It, and with Move It, if you hold the Alt button and just use the keys to toggle up and down, you can drag to the nodes even though they are attached to a building, and that kind of worked out pretty well. I wasn't quite sure if it was going to work. You know, sometimes if you play around with the nodes within a building, they can stuff it up a bit, but this looked like it might work, and we could always fix it down the track, so we'll just have to wait and see how that works. But at the moment, not too bad. And a train line that goes straight to a building, beautiful. At this point, I was still very much struggling with the placement of buildings, wanted there to be a real mix of larger and smaller warehouses, and also trying to figure out how the detail was going to look at some stage. We're going to leave that to the very end, which is not always my technique, but for this one, I felt like I needed to place down the buildings first and then figure out where the detailing is going to go. Now, I have made this analogy before, but kind of like painting a room in a house, you tend to realize that the rest of the areas also need a little bit of work. Yeah, maybe I'll just do a little coat of paint in the hallway. Maybe I'll just do a bit of painting in the other room. Maybe I'll do the living room. And then all of a sudden, you've painted the entire house. Well, this one started to snowball just like that. I started to work on some areas that I had no intention to build, but I pushed on regardless. I couldn't just leave these vanilla buildings right next to all the perfectly placed buildings that I just added. And I also wanted to figure out what the train line was going to do up here, because I did have this line that was running parallel to the waterway. It wasn't really directly influenced by anywhere in Miami, but I do think that this will make a very interesting line heading out into the swampland, but I also think we're definitely going to need it. This is going to be a very useful line getting cargo in and out right from all the farmland, even those other towns that we'll end up having out that way. We're going to need something, and I think that this makes a lot of sense. Plus, it just looks great. I love train lines that do this. And I know it's overkill, but whatever. I think it's fine. The only annoying thing was that we couldn't have a crossing and a bridge meet at the same node. So that was going to be problematic. And for now, I just made it so that it wasn't a bridge there, and it was fine because there was an invisible network that was still making it so that we had water going underneath. But it was making things a little bit difficult around here. That's fine, because I will come back to it because I've got a way of making it just a bit smoother down the track. But you know, just like those other parts that I didn't plan on building, well, here comes another one. Because this intersection was going to be a very, very busy intersection. With so much coming in and out of it, I felt like we needed to make something just a little bit more substantial that was going to hold out, you know, hold a lot more traffic coming in and out of the city, but then also traffic coming into our distribution center. So I figured, let's turn this into a highway, and that way we can make a bit of an overpass that goes over that road, and then if you want to get off and go to the distribution center or even that neighborhood over the other side of the waterway, then you can do that with a ramp. Now, of course, this does look pretty ugly and it is overkill at this stage, but I kind of like it. Like, I love these areas that are very different. I don't like cities to look exactly the same everywhere. I like it when you have Places that look like, yeah, they handle a lot of volume or high volume of traffic. I like places that look like they are transitioning to airports or distribution centers or places that are, you know, kind of on the outskirts of a city. These places are interesting. And this place over here, right next to these waterways, this is the kind of inspiration I'm taking for this part. So yeah, it kind of looks ugly in places, but that's also kind of intentional. I kind of like that. And I am not going to detail it that much at this stage, just going to leave it pretty bare bones, just so it's practical, just so it's there, and just a bit of a reminder that we are going to work on it some other time, but it's there, and it's working pretty well. Yeah, there's still quite a lot of traffic going to be banking up around these parts. There's an intersection that, yeah, it's going to get a bit of traffic, but at least it's a little bit more dispersed, and at least it's going to make things a little bit easier coming in and out of this place. It's not going to be perfect traffic, but I also don't really want it to be. To fix the bridge and intersection problem, I ended up placing a road just off that intersection and then deleting that road so that we still had the node so that I can drag it a little bit closer and thus removing that problem that we had before. Pretty easy fix. And with that, it was finally time to detail up our distribution center. Nah, just joking. Let's paint another room in the house. Just like those other areas, I couldn't leave this unfinished, so I deleted all the vanilla grown buildings and decided to then just turn this into another area that we were going to get cargo in and out using our train line. So I decided to drag out that train line even more and connect it up to another cargo terminal. I absolutely love the way that these unique factories work within the game. The way that they have to rely on the resources and the connections around the map. If you don't connect this thing up right, then yeah, it won't function very well. But if you've got a pretty decent connection and you've got resources feeding into those connections, then yeah, you're gonna make some money. And that was the plan with this thing. Having a rail line directly to it, I think is the best way of creating that. But unfortunately, you need more than just a good connection at the factory. You also need those cargo terminals elsewhere. I spent a little bit of time just adding in some extra buildings around here, not doing a huge amount of detail, really just adding in the bare bones to detail it up later on. I also wanted to add in another one of these corner buildings and I was hoping it was going to fit in perfectly. It didn't, so I had to drag out a couple of nodes and even use no controller on the surface up top just to drag out that node, and it ended up looking pretty decent. I was happy with the fact that it was a bit different to the other one. But then before I wanted to get into the detail work, I wanted to just drag out one more network. I of course don't really need one, but I just was thinking about the possibility of taking inspiration from this big concrete works that is in Miami in a pretty similar location to the other places we're taking ideas from. I think that this place would be really fun to create using the ore industry. We also have this train line that could be doing something quite similar, you know, big old terminal in this spot. We don't have any ore industry at this stage, so it would be kind of fun to have something that's kind of close to the city, a really big industrial zone that's dedicated to producing one type of thing. I think it would be kind of fun. And we do have the train line heading up here now, and it doesn't really go anywhere, so that could lead up to there. If we do build it, it'll probably sit somewhere towards the left-hand corner up there, you know, somewhere towards the swampland. But of course, that is a job for another day. We've got enough industry to build in this episode. But you know what? Before we build anything else, I think it's time to finally detail this bad boy up. This is always my favorite part of the build, when you finally get to the detail side of things and just adding in those little bits and pieces that make a place like this come alive. The details, the trees, the bits of industry, the trucks, the trailers, everything. I love this. And for the most part, I am keeping things fairly basic. I'm not doing anything too crazy in terms of detail. It's really just the trailers that add so much, and even some simple decals like the skid marks on the ground. And even that concrete brush tool, it is just such a simple thing to place down, but it adds so much, particularly in these industrial spaces. But then I really think the biggest difference is just adding in those little pockets and pops of color. The trailers, the containers, and even the trees. Just a nice contrast between all the rest of the concrete within the area. But as you can tell, there is still so much more to do. My biggest complaint at this point was the grass poking through was just a little bit too green for my liking. So I decided to go through and just use the resources brush to go through and just make it a little bit more rough around the edges. And this worked for the most part. I am always happy when I can change the ground color. It is just one of those tools that just makes such a huge difference. But there were just bits and pieces that I felt like I need to go through and just fine tune. What I am doing is I'm just trying to figure out the parts that I can just make it look really nice and, industrial in certain parts. And then that way I can copy and paste it into other parts of this area. Because at this stage, I'm only really detailing just a small little slither of this area. There was still so much of this space left to detail. But my technique has always been pretty much the same. I just kind of work on one little area, placing down and searching for all those little bits that I want to place down in one little area. And then when it comes to detailing the rest of it, well, it's just as simple as copying and pasting. And with that, things were looking pretty finished for our industrial zone. Yeah, this was a bit of a lengthy process, and I think that we did go a little overboard, maybe just a tiny wee little bit overboard, but I really wanted to build something like this within Sunset City. Some big old industrial zone with factories just all functioning and being all beautiful. I was stoked to finally finish it, but we're not finished yet, because I still have to place down the Sandbox Microsystem warehouse. Yeah, we still had to do that. Well, I also wanted it to be a functioning warehouse, or a functioning factory, that is. So I wanted to make sure that we were placing down the electronics factory as part of the Industries DLC. Only problem was, it was a little bit too big and a little bit too modern, and I also had no money. So I decided to check out what our unique factory was doing over here. Was it producing any money or any goods? Well, as it turns out, no, it's not. Yeah, because I didn't really have any resources around the map to fuel any of our industry. Massive oversight. So I left the city for a bit. Couldn't really make these unique factories and have them produce any money or any goods, or even be able to afford any of these if we didn't have any resources being produced throughout the map. So I decided, well, this would be a good spot to have some sort of oil industry. I always planned to place some around here, so this isn't something completely random, but I did want it just to be very, very bare bones, because this is really just to make a bit of money, just to sort of say, hey, this is where it's going to be. And I also wanted to see it transported using the rail line, which it was. So lovely. With that connection now established and our oil industry making us a bit of money, I could return to our industry and start figuring out how all this was going to take shape, now that we were finally making a bit of money and our warehouses were stocking all the goods that we needed to make them function the best way possible. I wanted to return back to our Sandbox Microsystems factory and just detail this up, make sure that it was looking fairly unique. I didn't want it to look like any of the other factories around here. And I also wanted it to be plastered with the Sandbox Microsystems logo all over it, because I've got that and it's great. But first, I wanted to make sure that it was going to function like a unique factory. So I am placing down a little cube, which acts like a factory rather than having to place down the vanilla one. I can place down some other warehouses and some other bits and pieces instead, which I think looks a whole lot better. But I was stoked to see trains making deliveries to our industrial zone and into our distribution center, right into this warehouse, which was so fabulous to see. So I powered on and continued to add more warehouses and bits and pieces to our Sandbox Microsystem factory. Not exactly doing anything too revolutionary. This is all pretty similar to the rest of the detail work around this area, but what I wanted it to be is just a functional space, something that was, you know, felt like a unique factory just like the others around this area, but then also sort of rocking its own style. So, you know, a big old distribution area that is a, you know, the biggest warehouse in the block, but then also some office space and some bits and pieces and places for parking and places for trucks to pull on in, you know, just something that felt functional, something that felt useful. And I'm also trying to figure out how this space would be used in real life. I don't really think they need a huge amount of space, and they could always extend out into other blocks if they need to, but I think with the collaboration with this phase space program, I think that's pretty exciting stuff for them. So maybe they will do some expansion a little bit later. We'll have to wait and see. But I am adding in some custom signs, going over some of the pre-existing signs on this building, and then also placing some onto the office block on the other side. But really, I love the fact that we can add these to the sides of these trucks. We obviously have some other ones that are custom made, these vans that are also out the front, which do look so fantastic. I was, though, a little bit disappointed in myself, I guess, because this wasn't really functioning the way that it should, because I, of course, don't have the resources around the map that are helping it to produce the microchips that it needs. So I decided that because we will end up placing something to do with ore industry out this way, well, at least most probably, I will just build something fairly temporary just so that we were producing the goods that we needed. This is something that won't stay, but just a bit of a, hey, we could do something out here. And if not here, it could be elsewhere, but something like that could exist. Definitely needs to exist. But as you can see, now that we've got resources on the map, we've got these beautiful connections with our rail line. We have just got this beautiful connection between our factories and everything else around the map, finally producing those goods that the city needs to make money, make clothes, make resources for the city, and one day, make rocket ships. My friends, thank you all so much for tuning in today's episode of Sunset City. I really appreciate it, and I'll say a huge thank you to all the people who have just recently subscribed. Thank you guys so much. My channel just blew up recently, and I really appreciate it. So if you're brand new here, thank you so much. It's awesome to see new people joining the channel and watching along and getting involved. And then also, to all the people who've just recently become patrons of the channel, again, thank you so much. It really does help to support the channel and helps me make videos. But a big shout out to Caitlin Hampton, Jake Christensen, Timmy Harden, Michael DeGroats, Diego Mello, Matt Anderson, Diego Ribeiro, Aloha Wide Gaming, Staxathin, Jay Evans III, Wang Peter, Joey F, Jimmy Sanchez, Slip Nodden, Christian Bomi, Andrew, Niels, and Lela Lenny. Thank you guys so much. Really, really appreciate it. Catch you all in the next one. Bye.